I know a place where the sun is like gold and cherry blossoms burst with snow, and down underneath is the loveliest nook where the four-leaf clovers grow. One leaf is for hope, and one is for faith, and one is for love, you know, and God put another in for luck. If you search, you will find where they grow. But you must have hope, and you must have faith. You must love and be strong, and so, if you work, if you wait, you will find the place where the four-leaf clovers grow. This is Ella Higginson's poem, Four-Leaf Clover. It was published in 1890, and it was an immediate hit. It was popular all over the place. It remained popular throughout her lifetime, and it is the only work of Ella Higginson's today that you can readily access. Ella Higginson was an American author in the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States. She was celebrated nationally and internationally for her fiction and her poetry, her nonfiction, a couple screenplays. She was the reason everyone knew what the Pacific Northwest was like at the time. It was a very remote area, and Ella Higginson was the one who translated the region for the world, really. Ella Higginson was born in Kansas, probably in 1862, and as a child, she moved to Oregon with her family, which is where she grew up. And in her early 20s, she got married, and she and her husband moved north to Bellingham, Washington, where she spent the next 52 years of her life until her death, and where she very quickly established a national literary reputation. Though she had been born in Kansas, she considered herself to be a Pacific Northwesterner through and through. In one of her poems called Yet Am I Not for Pity, which she had engraved on her burial monument. In that poem, the poem has two parts, and in the first part, she talks about how she'll never go to Europe, she'll never see all these statues and paintings, she'll never see Rome or Venice. But then in the second part of the poem, she talks about the Pacific Northwest and says, whereas things in Europe are wonderful but human-made, things in the Pacific Northwest are God-made. She writes an essay that's titled, I Am a Mossback, which was a slang name for a Pacific Northwesterner. I am a mossback to my very fingertips. Ella Higginson was very famous in the Pacific Northwest because the Pacific Northwest was a very underpopulated region at the time. And in addition to being underpopulated, in that underpopulation, there were many more men than there were women, and there were almost no authors, there were no publishing centers. So Ella Higginson was really out in the field by herself. The Pacific Northwest was extremely proud of her because she was the great Ella Higginson. She brought international attention to the Pacific Northwest. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the only way the rest of the world knew about the Pacific Northwest region and its cultures was through the poetry and the fiction of Ella Higginson. What people outside the Pacific Northwest knew of the Pacific Northwest at the time was that it was beautiful, but it was considered to be extremely remote. Even in 2013, it is the Seattle Seahawks who have to travel furthest of any NFL team. So the remoteness was considered to be a place that was so difficult to get to and so difficult to live in because it was beautiful but very wild. So Ella Higginson, in writing fiction and poetry about this place, fiction and poetry that became so popular, introduced the people of the Pacific Northwest, the towns, and in particular the women of the Pacific Northwest to the larger world. It's important to keep in mind that the Pacific Northwest was so underpopulated compared to the rest of the country at the end of the 19th century, and that there were many, many more white men than there were white women. So for instance, in New England, after the Civil War, when so many young men are either dead due to the war or have gone west, many women do not have the opportunity to marry. There are many more white women in New England at the time than men. The Pacific Northwest, a woman can marry whoever the heck she wants to. There are so many men. And so that really skews things in a certain way. So number one, the Pacific Northwest is underpopulated at the time. Number two, there are many, many more men than there are women. And number three, and pretty crucially, the Pacific Northwest is much more inclined toward the political enfranchisement of women than the rest of the country is. So women finally get the right to vote in the United States in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. However, women get the right to vote in Washington State a full 10 years earlier in 1910, and as a matter of fact, as early as 1854. women, there's a measure to give women the right to vote in the Washington Territory, and it fails by a single vote. So Ella Higginson is writing from a place that's underpopulated, that has many more white men than women, and that is inclined toward the enfranchisement of women. What that means is that when you read Ella Higginson's writing, you see these fictional Pacific Northwest women who are very independent, who are very hardworking, and who are very rural. Many of them choose not to marry. Many of them, when they do marry, if they find themselves in a very restrictive or oppressive marriage, they choose to leave that marriage. So the Pacific Northwest that she presents to the world is one that's extremely specific in terms of how its women are presented, and how those women are presented tells us a lot about what the culture was like at the time. What she wanted to convey to them about the Pacific Northwest is that it was not at all a loss to spend your life in what was viewed as such a remote place. Indeed, it could be considered to be a blessing to be in such a wildly beautiful place. You would not have urban areas. You would not be able to go to the opera all the time. However, what you would be able to do is live in this breathtakingly beautiful place, which for her was very spiritual. So she was very, very careful to present the Pacific Northwest to the larger world as a place where it was a privilege to live, and also a place that in its privilege was an integral part of the United States and not something that should be pushed off to the side and sort of glossed over. It was a real problem for writers who were not in the Northeast, which is where the publication centers were. It was a real problem for writers, particularly women writers, of course, to have access to publication methods. Ella Higginson happened to be born at the right time. At the end of the 19th century in the United States, there is an explosion in periodical publication. The numbers are just staggering. And as you get more and more periodicals, more and more magazines, more and more literary journals, you have a need for more and more material. At the same time, suddenly, now that the Civil War is over with, suddenly there is this big drive to get voices from all regions of the nation. And so Higginson, a woman who seemed to be born to write, found herself at a point where when she sent out her writing, this was exactly the kind of writing that they were looking for. Ella Higginson's impact on the area was profound in her lifetime. In the early 20th century, in 1914, she won a national prize for her short story, The Message of Anne Laura Sweet. She won $2,500 for the story, which then and now is decent literary money. The panel that awarded the prize had former President Theodore Roosevelt on it. Ella Higginson was the one who translated the Pacific Northwest for the rest of the world. Her impact was unique at the time, really. However, by the time she died in 1940, all her books were out of print. She was virtually forgotten outside of Bellingham, and she has remained virtually unknown, virtually uncovered since then. A lot of women writers tended to be forgotten or neglected once you made the turn into the 20th century. The turn into the 20th century, women writers, some of whom had been so famous. Zora Neale Hurston disappeared entirely. When Alice Walker goes looking for Zora Neale Hurston in 1975, she can hardly find out anything about her. Mary E. Wilkins Freeman, who no one thought would ever be forgotten, was almost entirely forgotten. It was a little bit harder for Ella Higginson because she had no children, so she had no children to protect her reputation or keep her books in print. She had no close family members who would have been able to do the same thing. She was very far from northeastern publication centers, which meant that her papers would be archived here at the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies, which is wonderful that they're there, but still far away from the papers of other writers of her time. And so she disappeared from sight. Now, some of those other women writers come back strongly with the rise of the feminist movement in the 1970s. That is not something that's happened yet with Ella Higginson, though of course I am hoping to change that. Since I have started researching her, she published, these are the numbers I have right now. I suspect there's more that's unrecovered. She published over 100 short stories and over 300 poems. Now that we're able to Google so much in so many different ways, I've been able to access a lot of the reviews of the time, many reviews that Higginson herself probably never saw. a huge range of reviews, all extremely positive, comparing her to other writers of the day or earlier writers such as Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Leo Tolstoy, Emile Zola, to the point where that's how prolific she was surprised me. The amount of reviews of her work surprised me. The very celebratory nature of those reviews surprised me too. And even though intellectually and theoretically I know that women writers are forgotten every single day, this blew my mind. It was just, she was so big and so important, and she has disappeared pretty much without a trace. I think it's important, I think it's almost more important that people outside of Washington State know about Ella Higginson than people within Washington State. In terms of the diversity of American literature, you have people like William Faulkner or Flannery O'Connor or Mark Twain who put certain regions of the United States on the literary map. That's what Ella Higginson did for the Pacific Northwest. The only way people knew about the Pacific Northwest at the time was through her writing. As long as her writing isn't recovered, a crucial piece of the diversity of American literature remains missing. So I think it's important, in terms of state pride, I think it's important that people remember Ella Higginson. But in terms of national pride, when you're talking American literature, you want the whole country represented. Because if you don't have the whole country represented, you can make the mistake of thinking that American literature is one monolithic voice. That's not what it is at all. We want all the literary voices involved. So it is still a real pleasure to read Ella Higginson's work today, because suddenly you see this remote frontier location come to life in this very dramatic way.